Just after dawn on June 4, 1944, a young American major lifted off from a forward airfield in southern England in a stripped-down P-51 Mustang. The aircraft carried no guns. In place of the wing armament sat cameras, mounted to look straight down and slightly to the side. The variant had its own designation, the F-6 Mustang, and the major flying it that morning was Joseph Thompson, Jr. of the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, 9th Air Force. He would later be attached to the 109th as well. By the end of the war, he would fly 90 combat missions over occupied Europe and come home with a distinguished flying cross with oak leaf clusters, the Air Medal, the Croix de Guerre, and, in his final days in March of 2012, the Legion of Honor from the government of France. But on this morning he was simply a pilot crossing the Channel toward the Norman coast. Visibility was poor. Cloud sat low over the water. As he climbed, the green pasture of England fell away behind him and the grey plate of the Channel slid underneath. He pushed the Mustang into a long, shallow dive toward the coastline near Grand Camp, levelled out at low altitude, and switched on the cameras. They began to roll, exposing frame after frame of 9-inch film as German anti-aircraft batteries opened up on him. A second aircraft, a spotter plane, flew in loose company nearby, calling out by radio how close each flak burst was falling, because Thompson could not see behind himself in the cockpit. At what felt like the last possible second, he hauled the Mustang up and hard to the right. A black bloom of flak opened where he would have been if he had broken left. He carried the film home. Within hours, technicians at a developing lab in England had run the wet rolls through a chemical bath, hung them to dry, printed them, and rushed the prints to interpreters who annotated bunkers, gun pits, vehicle parks, and trench lines. The information went into target folders, into bombardment plans, into the corrected red overprints on assault maps that thousands of American infantrymen would carry ashore 48 hours later. After the war, in debriefings, German artillery officers who had been on the receiving end of Allied fire in those weeks insisted that the accuracy was so uncanny, the corrections so quick, that the Allies must have possessed some secret device, a radar that guided shells, a new weapon. They could not accept that what they had been hit by was, in fact, a photograph. That belief, held by capable professionals who had no reason to make excuses for themselves, is the door into our story. Because the Germans had cameras, they had aircraft, they had photographic interpreters. They had, in some respects, started this whole enterprise. What they did not have, by the spring of 1944, was the system. And the system, more than any single image or aircraft, is what changed the battlefield. To understand what was in Thompson's cameras that morning, you have to understand the photomap. A photomap was not quite a photograph, and not quite a map. It was both. Hundreds of vertical aerial photographs, taken from straight overhead at a known altitude, were stitched into a seamless mosaic. Onto that mosaic, draftsmen overprinted grid lines, contour lines drawn from elevation data, road labels, place names, and a layer of tactical markings showing every gun, trench, minefield, and obstacle that interpreters had spotted, half cartography, half photography. A soldier could lay it on the floor of a Nissen hut, set a finger on his line of advance, and see at once both the abstract shape of the ground and the literal texture of it. The cameras that fed this machine were industrial in scale. The Fairchild K-17, mounted in the bellies of reconnaissance aircraft, exposed a 9-inch square negative. Lens cones came in focal lengths of 6, 12, and 24 inches, depending on the altitude and detail required. The handheld K-20 was lighter, used by crews leaning out of bomb bay doors and gun ports. About 15,000 K-20s were produced under license by Fulmer Graflex of Rochester, New York, between 1941 and 1945. There was also the Sony strip camera, a different beast altogether. Instead of a shutter, it had a narrow slit, and it ran its film at a speed synchronized to the ground speed of the aircraft. Pass over a coastline, and the Sony produced a single, continuous, unbroken strip of imagery, miles long, like a paper river of the world below. The aircraft that carried these cameras over occupied Europe were as varied as the cameras themselves. Foremost on the American side was the F-5 Lightning, the photo reconnaissance variant of the P-38, with its guns removed and its nose reshaped to hold a battery of cameras. Of the more than 13,000 P-38s built at Lockheed's Burbank plant, roughly 1,200 were configured for the F-4 and F-5 reconnaissance role. Alongside them flew the Photo Recon Spitfires of the Royal Air Force, polished smooth and stripped of armament, and the wooden de Havilland Mosquito, fast enough to outrun most of what the Luftwaffe could put up against it. By 1944, however, the Mosquito was increasingly hunted by a new threat, the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet, and reconnaissance crews counted themselves lucky to make it home. Once a sortie landed, the pipeline took over, and this was the part the Germans never quite matched. A pilot would lift off in the dim, pre-dawn light, climb to 25,000 feet over occupied France, do his run, and turn for home. Ground crews would meet him on the hard stand and unload the film canisters before the engines had fully cooled. Technicians working under red safe lights would develop, fix, wash, and dry the rolls. Wet prints, still tacky, would be carried at a run to interpretation rooms where photo interpreters bent over them with stereoscopes, instruments that fused two slightly offset images into a single three-dimensional view of the ground. An immediate report flagged urgent targets. A second and third phase of analysis, days later, compared the new coverage to earlier sorties, watching for changes. New gun pits, new track marks in the grass, new construction. From there, the imagery went to photogrammetric draftsmen who turned the picture into a map, and then to a lithographic plant that printed the result in multiple colors, folded it, packaged it, classified it, and shipped it to the front. From shutter click to soldier's hand, in some cases, less than a day. This whole apparatus had a long and surprisingly fragile pedigree. It begins on the morning of October 23, 1911, on a flying field outside Tripoli, in the opening weeks of the Italo-Turkish War. An Italian artillery captain named Carlo Maria Piazza climbed into a fragile French Blériot 11 monoplane, a single-seater of wood and canvas with an engine of about 50 horsepower, and lifted off just after 6 in the morning. He flew for roughly an hour over the desert, spotting Turkish positions, and came back. It was the first reconnaissance flight in the history of warfare. A few months later, on January 24, 1912, an aircraft of the same Italian unit produced what is generally considered the first aerial war photograph. Piazza himself would not survive the next conflict. In 1917, while serving on the Italian front in the First World War, he died of an infection contracted in the trenches. While Piazza was inventing the role, others began inventing the craft of interpretation. One of them was Hugh Hamshaw Thomas, a Cambridge paleobotanist with a quiet professorial manner and a gift for reading the strange shadows in a photograph. During the First World War, he served as a photographic officer in the Royal Flying Corps in Palestine, and from 1916 onward he helped pioneer the construction of trench maps from overlapping aerial strips. The lessons learned over Gaza and Beersheba would, decades later, return with him when, as a wing commander in the Royal Air Force, he became one of the senior figures at the Great Interpretation Centre at RAF Medmenham during the Second World War. Between the wars, however, the discipline largely went to sleep. Budgets shrank, cameras gathered dust. The aviators who had flown over the Western Front retired or returned to civilian life. By the late 1930s, Britain in particular had let its photographic reconnaissance capability decay to almost nothing. What revived it was a single, restless, almost piratical figure named Sidney Cotton. Cotton was an Australian businessman with a sideline in colour photography and a taste for risk. In the spring of 1939, he was approached by Frederick Winterbotham of the British Secret Intelligence Service. Winterbotham wanted someone who could fly over Germany under the cover of perfectly ordinary business trips and bring home photographs. Cotton was that man. He acquired a civilian Lockheed 12A, Electra Junior, a small twin-engined airliner, of the kind well-to-do executives flew across Europe in the 1930s. Behind sliding panels in the fuselage he hid F-24 cameras. He routed warm cabin air past the lenses to keep them from fogging at altitude. Then he flew to Berlin and Frankfurt and Mannheim, and in the back of his cabin the cameras clicked through the panel as he passed over airfields and naval yards. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, Cotton had been commissioned as an honorary wing commander and given charge of the photographic development unit at Heston Aerodrome. He stripped Spitfires of their guns, polished their surfaces to a glassy finish, and sent them over Germany at 30,000 feet. He argued bitterly with the Air Ministry about almost everything. Eventually, he was pushed out of the unit he had built. But the pattern he established, civilian agility wedded to military reach, the polished aircraft sent up high and fast, the relentless improvisation became the spine of British and then Allied reconnaissance. On the German side, somebody saw what was coming. In 1938, a Generaloberst named Werner von Fritsch made a remark that would later be quoted, sometimes with bitter irony, in Allied histories. "The military organization," he said, "with the best photographic reconnaissance unit will win the next war." Von Fritsch did not live to see how right he was. That same year he was forced from command of the German army by a fabricated scandal engineered by Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring. Recalled to duty as honorary colonel-in-chief of the 12th Artillery Regiment when war came, he chose to ride forward with his men in Poland, an unusual decision for a man of his rank. On September 22, 1939, in the Praga district outside Warsaw, a Polish bullet struck him in the left thigh and tore an artery. He bled to death within minutes. He was the second German general killed in the Second World War. The British, in the meantime, were building the institution that would prove von Fritsch's prediction correct. After bomb damage forced a move from Wembley in 1941, the Photographic Interpretation Unit shifted into Danesfield House, a mock Tudor pile at Medmenham in Buckinghamshire. There, on the chalk bluff above the Thames, the Central Interpretation Unit grew. Imagery flowed in from camera-equipped Spitfires and Mosquitoes operating out of RAF Benson. Interpreters, many of them women, many drawn from professions far removed from soldiering, archaeology, geology, classics, art history, leaned over light tables with stereoscopes and learned to read the world from above. American personnel began arriving in 1942 and grew steadily. On May 1, 1944, with the Americans a substantial share of the staff, the unit was renamed the Allied Central Interpretation Unit. By that point, its strength had passed 1,700 personnel. The numbers around it almost defy belief. By 1945, daily intake at Medmenham averaged 25,000 negatives and 60,000 prints. By VE Day, the print library held 5 million prints and 40,000 reports had been produced. In the run-up to D-Day, the unit was producing roughly 1,500 intelligence reports a month and pumping out something on the order of 600,000 prints a month for distribution down the chain of command. This was a knowledge factory in the most literal sense, a place where sight itself was manufactured. The work itself beneath those numbers was strangely domestic. The interpreters lived in requisitioned country houses around the village. They cycled to Danesfield in the morning, took meals in mess huts under the trees, and worked 12-hour shifts. The light tables in the great rooms of the house were lit day and night. Tea came around in metal pots. Eyes ached from hours at the stereoscope. New arrivals, especially the young WAAF officers, were trained in pattern recognition the way a botanist is trained in keys, learning the shape of a freight wagon from above, the difference between a real anti-aircraft battery and a wooden decoy, the telltale rectangular shadow of a buried fuel tank. The British and the Americans worked side by side. By the spring of 1944, an American photo interpreter could expect to share a stove and a billet with a Cambridge classicist or an Oxford archaeologist, all of them squinting through magnifying lenses at the texture of a French farm road. It mattered that the Germans, by this stage, could not reply in kind over Britain. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over the English Channel, and German reconnaissance aircraft could no longer fly with any confidence over southern England. That blindness had a strategic effect. It allowed the Allies to mount the great deception known as Operation Fortitude. Dummy landing craft were anchored in southeastern English ports. Inflatable rubber tanks lined fields in Kent. A fictitious 1st United States Army Group, commanded on paper by George Patton, was conjured into existence and pointed across the Strait of Dover at the Pas de Calais. Double agents, controlled by British intelligence, fed Berlin a steady diet of consistent lies. The official British history of the deception is candid about which elements actually mattered. The dummy tanks and the rubber landing craft, in the end, mattered far less than the radio traffic and the controlled double agents. Without German aircraft overhead to photograph the inflatable lie and report it home, the physical props were largely theatre for an audience that could not see them. What the Germans believed they knew came almost entirely through channels the British were quietly writing. While the British were running deception, the Americans were building their own photographic strike arm. The unit that came to symbolize it was the 7th Photographic Reconnaissance Group. Constituted on February 5, 1943, and activated on May 1st of that year, it moved without personnel or aircraft on July 7th to Mount Farm, a former satellite of RAF Benson set in the gentle fields of Oxfordshire near the village of Berensfield. There, it absorbed the existing 13th Photographic Squadron and grew into a 4-squadron group, the 13th, 14th, 22nd, and 27th. They flew F-5 Lightnings and Spitfire Mark 11s, called themselves the Eyes of the 8th Air Force, and adopted a motto that captured everything about their work: alone, unarmed, and unafraid. The motto was not bravado. It was a job description. Photo reconnaissance pilots flew single-ship missions. Their machines had no guns. Their only protection was speed, altitude, and a .45 caliber pistol stuffed in the cockpit. By war's end, the 7th had flown 4,251 sorties and brought home over 3 million photographs. 46 of its pilots were killed in action. 31 more were taken prisoner, listed missing, or had to evade capture on the ground. The group earned a distinguished unit citation for its coverage of the Norman coast in the period of May 31st through June 30th, 1944, and a French Croix de Guerre with Palm. It was inactivated at Hitcham, in England, on November 21st, 1945. A memorial dedicated in 1985 at Berensfield Village in Oxfordshire, and another at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado, mark what those young men did, and what too many of them did not come back from. The losses they sustained were part of a much larger toll. Of the roughly 350,000 airmen who served with the 8th Air Force, 26,000 were killed in action, more than the total combat dead of the entire United States Marine Corps in the same war. 28,000 more became prisoners of war. The historian Donald Miller has written that 77% of the Americans who flew against the Reich before D-Day became casualties. The men who took the photographs were a small sliver of that population, but they paid a sliver of that price. Photographs alone, however, did not become maps. For that you needed engineers. The American answer was the Engineer Topographic Battalion, an industrial cartographic shop on wheels. The 654th Engineer Topographic Battalion organized at Fort Custer, Michigan, before deploying overseas. Its operations officer in the run-up to D-Day was a young captain named Edward Killingsworth, a trained architect from Long Beach, California, who would, after the war, become one of the leading mid-century modernist designers in the United States. His Bronze Star citation reads, with characteristic Army flatness, that he was decorated for the production of more than 8 million photomaps in preparation for the Allied invasion of Europe. 8 million. An entire civilian publishing industry could not have matched that pace. The unit was issuing maps to the men who would walk on them. A sister formation, the 655th Engineer Topographic Battalion, was activated at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, on December 17, 1943. It started with about 28 enlisted men and a single officer transferred from the 650th, plus 5 officers pulled from other units, and grew to roughly 450 men. Its soldiers trained in survey, drafting, photo mapping, and 4-color reproduction. After the invasion, they followed the Allied armies across France, Belgium, Holland, and into Germany, printing maps off mobile presses set up in chateaux, in castles, in requisitioned barns and warehouses. Their world was ink and paper and the smell of solvent. Inside this culture of cartographic engineers, one staff sergeant of the 654th, Bob Crozier, it would later donate to the Library of Congress Geography and Map Division, a collection that opens a small window onto how all of this was actually taught. Among his papers is a 36-page booklet, prepared in 1944, that explains aerial reconnaissance and mapping for staff and field officers. Its narrator, in cartoon form, is a wide-eyed character named Snoop, drawn to demystify the whole pipeline. Snoop's most famous line, repeated in lectures for decades afterward, captured the work in a single rhythm. A 40-inch camera, a 400-mile-per-hour plane, 150 feet of fast film, a streamlined photo lab, a lot of navigation, and no guns. Crozier's collection also includes a captured German map of Caen, 15 aerial photographs, 20 maps, and a Rhine River Photomap section, 10-sheet B5 from 1945. It is the work of an army that treated maps as ammunition. By the spring of 1944, the pace of build-up was almost frantic. Reconnaissance sorties tripled along the Norman coast in the first week of June. Photo interpreters worked through the night. New maps came off the presses, still smelling of ink. Briefing rooms across southern England filled up with low-ranking soldiers staring at terrain they had never seen and trying to memorize where the seawall would be when the ramp dropped. To help them do that, an American captain at Medmenham named Samuel Batchelder was running one of the more extraordinary projects of the war. Batchelder and his small team prepared. In the months before the invasion, 97 precise contoured terrain models of the landing beaches and the country immediately behind them. Cardboard was cut to the height contours derived from photogrammetric measurements. The cardboard layers were stacked, smoothed, covered in rubber, and topped with photographic imagery of the actual ground, draped onto the contours like a skin. The result was a tabletop sculpture you could lean over and study from above, a literal three-dimensional rehearsal of the beach you would shortly assault. A second American officer, Captain Charles Burwell, made an additional contoured rubber model of the Utah beach sector. Burwell's model survives today in the Library of Congress Geography and Map Division. Soldiers who studied those models in May of 1944 were, in a real sense, looking at the ground from above before they ever saw it from a landing craft. All of this material was, of course, classified to the highest level. And here we come to one of the strangest and most evocative little stories in the whole apparatus, the Bigot classification. Bigot was a 5-letter mark, stamped in green ink at the head of a document, ranking above top secret. Its origins reach back to November of 1942 and Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. Officers headed from Britain to the new front were being routed through Gibraltar rather than across U-boat-patrolled waters, and their orders were stamped with the code word TOGIB, meaning to Gibraltar. Reverse those letters, and you get Bigot. The term stuck. By February 12, 1944, Bigot appeared at the head of the Operation Neptune Initial Joint Plan, the master document for the seaborne assault on Normandy. Only those on the Bigot list were permitted to know the actual landing sites and dates. The seriousness of that classification became cruelly clear during Exercise Tiger in late April 1944. American troops rehearsing a landing on Slapton Sands, on the Devon coast, were attacked at sea by German E-boats which had stumbled into the convoy. Hundreds were killed. Among the dead were officers cleared to the Bigot level, and the question that mattered to General Eisenhower in the hours afterward was not how many had died, but whether any had been captured alive. He ordered the recovery of the bodies of 10 known Bigot cleared officers from the water and from the beach to confirm that none of them was now in German hands. If even one had been taken, with what he carried in his head, the entire invasion plan would have had to be rewritten or cancelled. The maps those men carried, the ones they died protecting, were astonishing documents. Consider the assault sheet for Omaha Beach, printed at a scale of 1 to 12,500, titled, in straightforward Army prose, First Beach Obstacle Overprint. The base sheet showed roads in black, vegetation in green, and the contour lines of the bluff in brown. Over that base, in red ink, was overprinted everything Allied photo interpretation had identified about the German defences, updated to May 12, 1944. The detail was almost domestic. Belgian gates, the steel anti-landing craft frames, Czech hedgehogs of welded rail, log ramps tipped with mines, mined stakes set in the intertidal zone, anti-tank ditches running behind the seawall. Roadblocks at the village exits, minefields beyond the seawall, with each minefield symbol annotated with the number of rows, the spacing between rows, and the spacing of mines within each row. Below the map, a profile view showed the coastline as the men would see it from a landing craft, with a sober note that buildings near the beach might be destroyed by bombardment before any craft reached the shore. What the maps did not show, and could not show, was that Allied intelligence had missed something fundamental about who was waiting on Omaha. The Wehrmacht formation that defended the central Norman coast that June morning was the 352nd Infantry Division. It had been raised in November of 1943, built up around cadres of Eastern Front veterans, and commanded by a competent professional named Generalleutnant Dietrich Kreis. In March of 1944, Field Marshal Rommel ordered Kreis's division forward to take over the Bayou sector, including the bluffs above what the Allies had codenamed Omaha Beach and a portion of Gold Beach. Allied intelligence did not detect the move. On the morning of June 6th, planners still believed the 352nd was deployed inland, near St. Lo, available only for counterattack. American assault troops had been told to expect a single static regiment of low-quality troops on the beach itself. What they met instead was a full-strength infantry division, with combat experience, dug into prepared positions on commanding ground. The intelligence failure did not lose the day, but it was paid for in the surf at Omaha, and the bill ran into thousands of casualties before the bluffs were taken. The system was vast. It was not omniscient. It was at the very edge of that system, in the days before Joe Thompson flew his Grand Camp run, that another reconnaissance pilot brought home a roll of film that would change the war in a different way. To follow that thread, we have to go back, briefly, to the previous summer, and to a British photo interpreter at Medmenham named Constance Babington Smith. Babington Smith was born in 1912, the seventh of 9 children of a senior British civil servant. Before the war, she had written for the Aeroplane magazine, a publication of the British aviation press, and she joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAAF, in December of 1940. By 1943, she was running a small section of about a dozen interpreters at Medmenham dedicated to the German aircraft industry. The Air Ministry brief she had been given was, in her own recollection, almost comically vague. Look for anything queer. In late June of 1943, studying photographs of the Peenemünde airfield on the Baltic coast, she identified 4 small tailless aircraft sitting on the apron, surrounded by characteristic burn marks in the grass that she came to call jet marks. The aircraft, she eventually determined, were Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet rocket fighters, the first operational rocket plane in the world. That alone was a coup. It established her as one of the sharpest eyes at Medmenham, but the larger discovery was still ahead. On November 13, 1943, she was directed to look for evidence of a pilotless aircraft that British intelligence had begun to hear rumours about. On November 28, a de Havilland Mosquito flown by squadron leader John Merrifield returned with a sortie of photographs over Peenemünde. As Babington Smith studied the prints through her stereoscope, she saw something at the edge of a road that did not match anything she had seen before. A small ramp, banked up with earth, supporting an inclined rail. On additional frames she identified, on the ramp itself, a tiny cruciform shape, a midget aircraft in launch position. It was a V-1 flying bomb being prepared for a test flight. The discovery set the British and American photo interpreters on a hunt of staggering scale. Her section and others scoured roughly 1.2 million aerial photographs of northern France, looking for matching ramps. They found them, dozens of them, hidden in woods and farmland, the so-called ski sites, named for the curved storage buildings that resembled the toe of a ski. Operation Crossbow, the Allied bombing campaign against the V-1 infrastructure, used her targeting information. By the end of 1943, the first generation of launch sites in northern France had been flattened. Hitler's vengeance weapon was not stopped, only delayed. But the delay mattered. It bought weeks of breathing room during the most critical period of the invasion build-up. After VE Day, Babington Smith was attached to United States Army Air Force's intelligence in Washington to continue her work, this time for the war against Japan. In 1946, the United States awarded her the Legion of Merit. In 2015, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency inducted her into its Geospatial Hall of Fame. Today, the imagery analysts who lean over screens at Fort Belvoir and Springfield trace a direct lineage to a young WAAF officer who in 1943 was told to look for anything queer. While Babington Smith was finding what was there, German camouflage officers were attempting, with considerable creativity and almost no success, to hide what was. The most famous of their failures came at Hamburg in 1941, in an operation the Germans called Tarnkappe, the cap of invisibility. The plan was to disguise the inner basin of the Ulster River, the Binnenalster, and an artificial lake of about 500 by 450 yards in the heart of the city. Engineers covered the water with a wooden, painted superstructure designed to look from the air like another district of buildings and streets. They constructed a fake Lombard's Bridge across the Ossenulster to suggest the location of a false Binnenalster, displaced slightly to the north. It was vast, expensive, and ingenious. It was also useless. The RAF bombers heading for Hamburg navigated by the Elbe River, not the Alster. And once the photographs started coming back to Medmenham, British photo interpreters quickly identified the wooden covering as artificial. A similar attempt in Berlin, where camouflage netting was strung over the Charlottenburger chassis for several miles to disguise it as part of Hitler's planned east-west axis, fared no better. Allied bombing crews continued to find what they were looking for. Camouflage works only against an enemy who cannot see well enough to distinguish art from earth. The Allied pipeline had crossed that threshold years earlier. The full extent of what the Germans had attempted, and how they had thought about photographic intelligence themselves, became clear only at the end of the war, when Allied teams swept across Germany and Austria looking for the captured archives of the Luftwaffe. The umbrella project was codenamed Turban. The richest single haul, a vast cache of negatives and prints found at Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, was secured by an American team within hours of Soviet forces arriving in the area. That cache was given the codename Dick Tracy. Other large collections were grouped under their own labels for sites in Vienna, Oslo, and Berlin. Combined, the captured material became known as the GX collection. The GX material would prove to be an unexpected gift. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, when the West had almost no aerial coverage of the Soviet Union and could not yet fly over it with confidence, GX images, especially those of Soviet territory taken by German reconnaissance crews during the Eastern Front campaigns, fed Western target folders and were used to generate predicted radar imagery for nuclear strike planning. Today, roughly 1.2 million GX prints reside at the National Archives Cartographic Branch in Record Group 373, with counterpart material at the National Collection of Aerial Photography in Edinburgh and overlapping holdings shared between the two. What the GX material also revealed, almost incidentally, was how seriously the Germans themselves had taken aerial photography and how clearly some of their officers, in post-war interrogations, understood what had happened to them. They had had cameras of high quality. They had had aircraft. They had had skilled interpreters. What they had not had was the integrated pipeline at Allied scale, the print library that could turn over 5 million sheets, the daily intake measured in tens of thousands of negatives, the topographic battalions printing photomaps off mobile presses, the assault sheets in every junior officer's pocket, the rubber relief models laid out on briefing room tables. The asymmetry was not in any single piece of hardware. It was in the way the pieces had been put together. The pipeline was not infallible. The 352nd Infantry Division on Omaha is one example of what it could miss. There were others. But its failures were the failures of a working system, the gaps in a net that was, by mid-1944, otherwise tight enough to be terrifying. Consider, by way of contrast, what it caught. Point de Hoc, the German strongpoint west of Omaha, had been photographed by Allied reconnaissance carefully enough that planners knew the heavy guns originally emplaced there had been removed and replaced, in May of 1944, with telegraph poles painted to look like artillery. The maps in the hands of the Rangers who scaled the cliffs on D-Day had been updated to reflect the change, with the gun positions notated as under construction. The Germans had attempted a deception. The Allies had photographed it, interpreted it, and printed the truth. That is what the system could do, on a good day, when the eyes were open and the lab worked. It is also worth saying plainly what Joe Thompson's footage, and the footage of hundreds of pilots like him, actually accomplished. It pulled the curtain back. The country under occupation had been, until the cameras arrived, partly a rumour to Allied planners. After the cameras, the country became visible. Bridges, marshalling yards, coastal batteries. The pattern of trucks parked near a woodline, the shape of a new airfield under construction outside Munich. The truth on the ground became, for the first time in the history of war, an industrial product, mass-produced and distributed through chains of custody. Soldiers, walking forward in 1944, were the first generation of soldiers in human history to enter unfamiliar terrain, already knowing in detail what was there. When the war in Europe ended, the apparatus did not stop. In June of 1945, after VE Day, the 305th and 306th Bombardment Groups, units that had spent 2 years dropping bombs on Germany, were detailed not to transfer to the Pacific, but to a new mission codenamed Project Casey Jones. Their B-17s were converted to carry mapping cameras instead of bombs. From bases in Belgium, Germany, and elsewhere, they flew systematic photographic mapping missions over Iceland, much of Europe, and North Africa. In a small twist that captures the strangeness of the moment, the same crews who had bombed Lechfeld Airfield in March of 1944 now flew photo runs out of the same airfield as part of the occupation. Project Casey Jones continued until December of 1946. The base mapping it generated would shape Western military cartography of Europe well into the early Cold War. The veterans of Medmenham, meanwhile, organized themselves into something quieter but enduring. In 1946, they founded the Medmenham Club to keep photo interpreters in touch with one another after demobilization. The club grew into the Medmenham Association, which still exists today, and maintains the Medmenham collection at RAF Whiten in Cambridgeshire. The collection holds roughly 26,000 catalogued items, including handwritten interview notes by Constance Babington Smith and the personal notebooks of the Cambridge professor and photo interpreter Glyn Daniel. The first president of the Medmenham Club was Wing Commander Hugh Hamshaw Thomas, the paleobotanist who had photographed Turkish trenches over Gaza nearly 30 years earlier. The thread did not stop with the club. On November 24, 1954, President Eisenhower authorized the development of a new high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft under joint direction of the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Air Force. The CIA's part of the program was codenamed Aquatone. The aircraft was given a deliberately bland designation, U-2, the U standing for the vague word utility, intended to draw as little attention as possible. The U-2 made its first flight in August of 1955. Its first overflight of the Soviet Union came on July 4, 1956. The men who built and ran it, in Lockheed's Burbank Skunk Works and in CIA backrooms in Washington, were largely the same generation who had cut their teeth on K-17s and F-5 Lightnings over France. The Dragon Lady, as the U-2 was eventually nicknamed, flew at 70,000 feet over Russia, taking photographs whose great-great-grandparents had been the wet prints rushed under red safelights at RAF Benson. On May 1, 1960, the U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace, and the program shifted decisively toward satellite reconnaissance. The CIA and Air Force satellite program, codenamed Corona, with its related Argonne and Lanyard projects, took more than 860,000 photographs from orbit between 1960 and 1972. Those photographs remained classified for decades. In February of 1995, President Bill Clinton signed an executive order declassifying the imagery, and Corona's pictures of the world, taken from space at the height of the Cold War, were released to the public. They are now housed at the National Archives and the United States Geological Survey. Researchers use them today to study lost archaeological sites, vanished glaciers, and the changing shape of cities. The records of the Second World War apparatus that produced them are scattered, but accessible to anyone who cares to look. The United States National Archives at College Park, Maryland, in Record Group 373, holds the Defense Intelligence Agency records, including overlay indexes for sortie plots, rolled negatives, and the captured German GX prints. The Library of Congress, Geography and Map Division holds the Bob Crozier collection, including the Snoop booklet and the captured German map of Caen. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project and the Special Collections Division of the Nashville Public Library hold the Joe Thompson papers and the roughly 600 photographs he donated. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum holds K-20 cameras and reproductions of the Batchelder photographs of Norman beach defences. The National Collection of Aerial Photography in Edinburgh holds approximately 5.5 million surviving images from the Allied Central Interpretation Unit. The Imperial War Museum and the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon hold cameras, prints, and personal papers. The Medmenham collection at RAF Whiten holds rubber relief models, flight logs, and the recollections of those who worked on them. The Perry Castaneda Map Library at the University of Texas at Austin holds extensive runs of the wartime topographic series. These archives are not a memorial. They are a working library, still consulted by historians, by environmental scientists comparing wartime photography to modern landscapes, and, occasionally, by intelligence analysts looking for the lineage of their own craft. That brings us back, finally, to a remark made in 1938 by a German Generaloberst who would be dead within a year. Werner von Fritsch said the military organization with the best reconnaissance unit would win the next war. In a literal sense, he was correct. The military organization that did win was the one that had built, by 1944, the deepest pipeline of cameras, aircraft, photo interpreters, draftsmen, lithographers, topographic battalions, and engineers. It was not the Luftwaffe that he served. It was the Anglo-American partnership that ran across the chalk bluff at Medmenham, through Mount Farm in Oxfordshire, through Fort Custer in Michigan, and Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, through a printing plant in a Belgian chateau, through the cockpit of an unarmed Mustang over Grand Camp on the morning of June 4, 1944. The lineage from that morning to the satellites overhead today is unbroken. The same impulse, see the ground, share the picture, give the man on foot a map he can trust, runs from Carlo Piazza's Blériot in 1911 through Hugh Hamshaw Thomas in Palestine, through Sidney Cotton's polished Lockheed, through Constance Babington Smith bent over a stereoscope at Medmenham, through Joe Thompson banking hard right as a flak burst opens on his left wing, through the U-2 over Sverdlovsk and Corona over Vladivostok, and the high-resolution feeds running into screens at Springfield, Virginia this morning. Joe Thompson came home from the war to Tennessee. He lived a long civilian life, and in his later years he gave an oral history interview to the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, donated nearly 600 of his wartime photographs to the Special Collections Division of the Nashville Public Library, and was honored repeatedly by the government of France for the work he had done in the skies over Normandy. The Legion of Honor came in March of 2012, in the final days of his life. He died on March 24th of that year. The photographs he took from the cockpit of his F-6 Mustang, the ones the German gunners thought had to have been guided by some secret radar, sit today in folders at the Library of Congress and in the Nashville Public Library, where any citizen with an appointment can sit at a table and turn through them, frame by 9-inch frame, and look at the ground he saw.